Imagine a man who never spent a single night in a prison cell. A man who hosted barbecues for judges and police chiefs in his sprawling, respectable suburban home. A doting father seen by his neighbors meticulously tending to his own garden. Now, hold that image and juxtapose it with this: the same man was, for over 5 decades, the undisputed, absolute monarch of one of the most brutal and profitable criminal empires in American history. He sanctioned murders with a quiet nod, orchestrated the systemic corruption of an entire metropolis, and outmaneuvered the FBI with such masterful precision that they often wondered if their prime target was merely a phantom, a ghost they could never quite grasp. This is not the plot of a Hollywood thriller or a fictional gangster epic. This is the authentic, documented, and utterly astonishing story of Tony Accardo, the man who truly ruled Chicago, the silent king who reigned long after the flashy crowns of others had turned to dust. Before we embark on this deep and detailed journey into the shadowy corridors of 20th century power, a crucial disclaimer must be stated clearly. This entire narrative has been meticulously compiled and cross-referenced from a vast array of historical sources, including declassified FBI files, federal court transcripts, testimonies from Senate investigative committees, memoirs of law enforcement officials, and rigorously researched biographies. The purpose of this presentation is solely to bring to you, the audience, a comprehensive and accurate account of these historical events, with the aim of educating and informing, not to sensationalize or glorify the acts of crime and violence that form a part of this dark chapter. The intention is to understand the intricate and often terrifying reality of how power can operate from the shadows. If you find these deep dives into hidden history, these revelations of the truths that lie beneath the official surface to be fascinating, then I strongly encourage you to ensure you are subscribed to the channel with all notifications activated, because the stories that the world often tries to forget are, invariably, the ones we most critically need to remember and comprehend. The tale of Tony Accardo is a masterclass in the longevity of illicit power, a lesson in the stark difference between celebrity and true, enduring control. Our story begins not in the blinding glare of notoriety, but in the quiet, desperate, and hopeful shadows of a new century dawning. Chicago in the early 1900s was a roaring, steaming, stinking crucible of raw ambition. It was a city being forged in the fires of industry, its skyline built by steel, and its wealth swimming in the rivers of blood from its legendary stockyards. It was a magnet, drawing in hundreds of thousands of immigrants from across Europe, all of them clutching the same dream of a better life, of freedom, of opportunity. Among this vast, teeming multitude were the Accardo family, who had made the long and arduous journey from the sun-drenched, yet often impoverished, hills of Sicily. They carried with them not just their meager belongings, but the old world traditions of tight, knit family, unbreakable honor, and a deep-seated, culturally ingrained distrust of any external authority that was not their own. Anthony Joseph Accardo was born into this specific world on April 28, 1906, and the gritty, cobblestone streets of Chicago's near West Side, the heart of the Italian immigrant enclave, would become his only real classroom, his true university of life. The son of a barber, Francesco Accardo, young Tony was not drawn to the legitimate, back-breaking struggles of his parents' generation. He was a short, stocky, and powerfully built boy, and what he initially lacked in physical height, he more than compensated for with a ferocious, almost primal, temper and an unshakable confidence that belied his years. He learned with startling rapidity that on these merciless streets, respect was not a polite social courtesy to be given. It was a commodity to be taken, seized through a demonstration of sheer will, and when necessary, overwhelming force. By the age of 14, formal education had already lost all meaning for him. He dropped out of school and swiftly formed his own street gang, a collection of like-minded, tough kids who specialized in petty theft, shakedowns, and strong-arm robberies. It was during this formative period of youthful delinquency that he earned his first and most telling nickname. It was not the later, more famous moniker of Big Tuna, but the far more visceral and descriptive Joe Batters. The name was bestowed upon him not by a fellow street urchin, but by the rapidly ascending star of the Chicago underworld, the man who would soon become a national symbol of lawless prosperity, Alphonse, Scarface, Capone. The event that earned him this name was as brutal as it was defining. Accardo, then a teenager, had been tasked with dealing with two members of a rival gang who had overstepped their bounds. His chosen instrument of persuasion was a baseball bat. With a cold, methodical, and devastating efficiency, he beat the two men to a pulp, leaving them broken and, according to some accounts, nearly dead. Capone, upon hearing the details and witnessing the results, was not horrified, he was impressed. He saw in the quiet, brooding, and intensely focused teenager something he recognized and valued: a perfect, almost alchemical blend of unthinking, explosive violence and thoughtful, patient calculation. Tony Accardo, Capone realized, wasn't just another mindless thug. He was an artist with his chosen tools. Whether that tool was a Louisville Slugger, a .45 caliber pistol, or, as would later become his primary instrument, a complex ledger book. This violent display was his formal entry into the big leagues, his bloody initiation into the organization that would one day be his alone to command. He started at the bottom, as a driver and a personal bodyguard for Capone himself. It was a lowly position in the hierarchy, but it was arguably the most strategically important one for an ambitious young man. It placed him at the very epicenter of power, a silent, watchful shadow in the room where all the critical decisions were made. He was the ultimate student of the game, a quiet observer watching how the master, Capone, operated, how he bribed politicians, how he intimidated unions, how he negotiated treacherous alliances with other gangs, and, most importantly for Accardo's own future, how he managed the sprawling, chaotic, and unimaginably profitable business of illicit alcohol during the era of Prohibition. He saw the intoxicating glory and the gut-wrenching gore, the immense, previously unthinkable profits flowing from bootlegging, and the rivers of blood that were spilled in the streets to protect those profits. This was Tony Accardo's undergraduate and postgraduate education, and he graduated with highest honors, all without ever setting foot in a school again. The era of prohibition was Tony Accardo's boot camp, a violent, chaotic, and immensely profitable period that hardened him and refined his skills. While Al Capone became the flamboyant, public face of the Chicago outfit, gleefully posing for photographs and giving boastful interviews to newspapers, Accardo cultivated the opposite persona. He was the shadow, the quiet enforcer who understood that true power did not need a spotlight. His role evolved from being just a driver and bodyguard to becoming one of Capone's most trusted and reliable hitmen. He was a key participant in the most defining and brutal event of the Chicago gang wars, the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. While the exact nature of his involvement has been debated by historians and fiercely denied by Accardo himself throughout his life, the prevailing theory among law enforcement and crime historians is that he was one of the key gunmen. On that cold, gray morning, 7 members of Bugs, Moran's North Side gang, were lined up against a garage wall and ruthlessly executed by a firing squad, some of them disguised as police officers. It was an act of such shocking public brutality that it fundamentally changed the nation's perception of organized crime. The massacre was Capone's masterstroke to eliminate his primary rival, but it also brought an unprecedented level of heat from federal authorities. Accardo, however, remained unscathed, his name unknown to the public, his face absent from the newspapers. This was his first major lesson in the art of invisibility. He saw how Capone's very fame became his greatest liability. The federal government, unable to pin a murder charge on him, finally got him for the comparatively mundane crime of tax evasion. As Capone was led away to Alcatraz in 1931, the outfit faced a power vacuum. The leadership initially fell to Capone's old guard, but a new, more corporate-minded generation was waiting in the wings, and at its forefront was the quiet, calculating Joe Batters. The transition of power in the Chicago outfit was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, deliberate, and blood-soaked consolidation. The man who ultimately emerged as the new boss was Frank, the enforcer, Nitti, Capone's former lieutenant. But Nitti, understanding the changing landscape, was smart enough to recognize that the old ways of public gang warfare were bad for business. He began to systemize the outfit, moving it away from the volatile bootlegging trade and into more stable, long-term criminal enterprises like labor racketeering, control of the nascent jukebox industry, and illegal gambling. In this new, more corporate structure, Tony Accardo found his true calling. He was not just a muscleman. He possessed a sharp, analytical mind for business. Nitti appointed him as a top lieutenant, placing him in charge of the outfit's crucial wire service and gambling operations. This was Accardo's first real taste of executive power. He was no longer just following orders. He was helping to formulate strategy, to manage vast illicit cash flows, and to oversee a network of bookmakers that stretched across the Midwest. He learned how to launder money through legitimate looking fronts, how to use threats and violence not for public spectacle, but for quiet, efficient business enforcement, and how to build a web of corruption that reached into the police departments, city hall, and the courts. This period also saw the solidification of his personal life. He married Clarice Porter, a woman far removed from the criminal world, and together they would have 4 children. He purchased a large, comfortable, but not ostentatious brick home in the peaceful suburb of River Forest. To his neighbors, he was a successful, if somewhat private, businessman, perhaps in the jukebox or vending machine industry. He was a family man who attended church, a far cry from the stereotypical gangster. This deliberate cultivation of a normal, respectable facade was one of his most brilliant and effective strategies. It provided him with a perfect cover and insulated his family from the horrors of his work. However, the pressures of leadership proved too much for Frank Nitti. Hounded by federal investigations and facing a new indictment, Nitti, in a dramatic and symbolic act, committed suicide in 1943. This event cleared the path for the next generation. The leadership of the outfit was assumed by a triumvirate: Paul, the waiter; Ricca, the political fixer; Louis, Little New York; Campagna, a powerful capo; and Tony Accardo, the brain and the muscle. It was a partnership that would guide the outfit into its golden age, an era of unprecedented wealth and power. And it was here that Tony Accardo would truly begin to build his legend, not as a notorious gangster, but as the untouchable CEO of Crime Incorporated. The end of World War II, I ushered in a new era of prosperity for America, and for the Chicago outfit, it was a period of unprecedented expansion and entrenchment. A golden age meticulously engineered by the strategic mind of Tony Accardo, with Paul Ricca handling the high-level political connections and Accardo managing the day-to-day operations and enforcement. The organization evolved from a powerful street gang into a sophisticated, corporate-like syndicate. Accardo's philosophy was simple, brutal, and incredibly effective: avoid the flashy, high-profile violence that had doomed his predecessors, and focus with laser-like precision on the bottom line. The outfit's revenue streams diversified and multiplied under his de facto leadership. Illegal gambling remained the cash cow, a river of untaxed money flowing from thousands of wire rooms, policy racks, and dice games across the city and beyond. But Accardo, with his forward-thinking vision, pushed the organization into realms that were, on the surface, perfectly legitimate. The jukebox and vending machine industries became a particular specialty. Through a combination of strategic mergers, ruthless intimidation of competitors, and sweetheart deals with restaurant and bar owners, the outfit gained a virtual monopoly. This provided not only a massive, clean-looking revenue stream, but also a perfect vehicle for laundering the immense profits from their illicit activities. It was during this period, in the late 1940s, that Accardo earned his famous nickname, Big Tuna. The popular myth, one he never bothered to correct, was that it stemmed from a fishing trip where he had caught a large tuna. In reality, it was a piece of underworld slang. Tuna was code for a large, profitable score, a big payday. The name Big Tuna was a quiet, insider acknowledgement of his unparalleled ability to generate wealth for the organization. He was the man who brought in the biggest catches. While he enjoyed the trappings of his success, a Cadillac, fine clothes, a beautiful home, he never flaunted it with the garish ostentation of a Capone. His power was displayed not in diamond pinky rings, but in the quiet deference he received from judges, politicians, and union bosses. He could make or break a political career with a single phone call. He held immense sway over the powerful Teamsters Union, influencing its pension funds and using its muscle for the outfit's benefit. This was the pinnacle of his influence. A time when the line between the criminal underworld and the legitimate power structures of Chicago became so blurred as to be virtually invisible. The outfit didn't just exist in Chicago. It was a fundamental part of its operating system. Accardo's genius lay in his understanding of this symbiosis. He ensured that the right people were paid, the right favors were granted, and the right threats were implied, never explicitly stated. He operated from a suite of offices in the loop, conducting his business with the demeanor of a corporate executive, which, in every functional sense, he was. He reviewed financial statements, approved major investments, and settled territorial disputes between his subordinates. Violence was always a tool, but it was now a tool of last resort, deployed with surgical precision. A businessman who refused to sell his vending machine company might find his warehouse burned to the ground. A bookmaker operating without paying the outfit's street tax might be visited by Accardo's enforcers and given a very persuasive final warning. The bodies that did turn up were often found in remote ditches or abandoned cars, their deaths serving as a quiet, chilling reminder to those in the know of the terrible price of defiance. This period of calm, profitable dominance was, however, about to be challenged. The federal government had not been idle. In 1943, the same year Nitti died, Accardo had faced his first serious legal threat, a draft evasion charge. He was acquitted, a testament to his ability to work the system. But a far greater storm was brewing, one that would see the might of the U.S. government focus directly on him and his inner circle. The event that would trigger this unprecedented crackdown was not a murder in a Chicago alleyway, but a scandal in the sunny, glamorous world of Hollywood, an industry the outfit had quietly infiltrated and begun to milk for millions. The storm that threatened to dismantle Tony, Accardo's carefully constructed empire, did not originate in the gritty streets of Chicago, but in the glamorous, sun-drenched studios of Hollywood, a testament to the vast and far-reaching tentacles of the outfit's influence. The connection was the Chicago-based International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, IHC, a union whose president, Willie Byoff, was a corrupt puppet controlled directly by Paul Ricca and the outfit. Through a brutal campaign of intimidation, strikes, and violence, Byoff, under the outfit's orders, had extorted millions of dollars from major film studios like 20th Century, Fox and Lowe's Incorporated. The studios, terrified of having their production schedules disrupted, paid what was essentially protection money, a massive stream of illicit cash that flowed directly back to Chicago. This lucrative racket operated smoothly for years, a classic example of Accardo's low-profile, high-profit business model. However, the scheme began to unravel when a dogged and courageous federal investigator from the IRS, working with the U.S. Department of Justice, started to piece together the complex financial trail. The investigation led directly to Bioff, who, facing a long prison sentence, did the unthinkable in the world of organized crime. He decided to cooperate with the government. Bioff's testimony was a bombshell. He named names, pointing the finger directly at the highest echelons of the Chicago outfit: Paul, the waiter; Ricca, Louis, Little New York, Campagna; and, for the first time in a major federal indictment, Tony Accardo. The charge was conspiracy to extort. This was a monumental crisis for Accardo, who had meticulously avoided the spotlight and any direct connection to prosecutable crimes. It was a direct and dangerous challenge. In 1943, he was indicted and found himself facing a high-profile trial. The outcome was a stark lesson in the limits of the outfit's power when confronted with the full force of the federal government. Unlike his earlier draft evasion acquittal, this time the evidence, backed by Bioff's detailed testimony, was overwhelming. Accardo, along with Ricca Cagna and several other top bosses, was convicted. The sentence was a staggering 10 years in federal prison. For a man who had never spent a night in jail, this was a catastrophic development. It meant the loss of control, the humiliation of incarceration, and the very real danger that his empire would be carved up by rivals in his absence. However, in a move that demonstrated the sheer audacity and deep-rooted political corruption the outfit commanded, they managed to pull off one of the most brazen manipulations of the American justice system in history. After serving only a fraction of their sentences at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, Ricca, Accardo, and the others were mysteriously and abruptly paroled. The official reason was overcrowding in the prisons due to the war effort, but the real reason was a massive, covert lobbying campaign and the application of immense political pressure, allegedly involving bribes and favors that reached into the highest levels of the Justice Department and even the White House. Their release after just a few years was a national scandal, a clear signal that the outfit's power was not confined to Chicago. But for Tony Accardo, the brief taste of prison life had been a profound and transformative shock. It reinforced his core belief in anonymity and his aversion to the flashy lifestyle that attracted law enforcement attention. Upon his release, he made a strategic decision that would define the rest of his criminal career. He officially stepped back from the day-to-day operations, at least on paper. The title of boss was passed to a younger, more visible and volatile gangster named Sam Momo Giancana. This was a masterstroke. Giancana, with his flashy suits, public arrogance, and high-profile affairs with celebrities like Phyllis McGuire and Frank Sinatra, would become the new public face of the outfit, drawing the heat and the headlines like a lightning rod. Meanwhile, Tony Accardo, now operating as the chairman of the board, retained the ultimate authority. He was the power behind the throne, the elder statesman whose approval was required for all major decisions, from the initiation of new members to the authorization of a hit. He continued to live quietly in River Forest, managing the outfit's vast financial portfolio and settling disputes from a distance. He let Giancana play the role of the gangster prince in the city, while he reigned as the unseen king from the suburbs, an arrangement that perfectly suited his desire for safety, stability, and continued profit, all while letting someone else absorb the dangerous glare of the public eye. The arrangement with Sam Giancana as the front man and Tony Accardo as the hidden power proved to be a period of immense profitability, but also of growing internal tension for the Chicago outfit. Giancana, a product of the city's tough west side, was a capable and ruthless leader, but his temperament was the polar opposite of Accardo's calculated calm. Giancana thrived on the notoriety. He held court in his own booth at the Armory Lounge, basked in the glow of celebrity friendships, and his name became synonymous with the swaggering, dangerous allure of the Chicago mob. Under his direct, hands-on management, the outfit's operations expanded and modernized. He aggressively pursued new revenue streams, particularly in the burgeoning realm of Las Vegas. The outfit, using funds from the Teamsters Union Pension Fund, secretly invested in and skimmed millions from several major casinos on the Strip, including the Stardust, the Riviera, and the Desert Inn. This skimming operation was perhaps the most lucrative single enterprise in the outfit's history, a river of untraceable, untaxed cash that flowed directly into the pockets of the bosses back in Chicago, with Accardo as the senior partner receiving the lion's share. Giancana also deepened the outfit's involvement in national politics through his connections to the CIA. In one of the most bizarre and sinister chapters of Cold War history, the CIA, desperate to eliminate Fidel Castro, enlisted Giancana and the outfit's expertise in assassination. The plan was to use mobsters with contacts in Cuba to poison Castro. This collaboration between America's premier intelligence agency and its most powerful criminal organization was a testament to the sheer reach and perceived competence of the Chicago syndicate. While these high-stakes games were being played, Tony Accardo watched from his suburban fortress, growing increasingly uneasy. He saw Giancana's very public profile as a ticking time bomb. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had finally acknowledged the existence of organized crime and had launched a major offensive, with Giancana squarely in their crosshairs. His phones were tapped, his movements were surveilled, and he was frequently hauled before federal grand juries. To Accardo, this was a violation of their most sacred rule: avoid the spotlight. Giancana's flashy lifestyle was attracting exactly the kind of heat that Accardo had spent a lifetime avoiding. The final straw likely came with the election of President John F. Kennedy. Giancana had, through complex and murky channels, allegedly played a role in helping Kennedy win the crucial state of Illinois in the 1960 election, when the Kennedy administration, led by the president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, subsequently launched an unprecedented war on organized crime, Giancana felt betrayed. His very public fury and his threats against the Kennedys made him a liability of incalculable proportions. Then, in 1963, the unthinkable happened. President Kennedy was assassinated. While there is no credible evidence linking the Chicago outfit directly to the assassination, the swirling rumors and Giancana's own known hostility created an atmosphere of extreme peril. The outfit was now potentially in the crosshairs of the most massive investigation in American history. For Tony Accardo, the master of risk management, this was an intolerable situation. A boss who could not control his temper or his public image was a danger to the entire organization. The man who had drawn the map was now leading them all into a quagmire. Furthermore, Giancana's legal troubles were mounting. He was facing relentless pressure from federal prosecutors and was eventually forced to testify before a grand jury, where he repeatedly took the Fifth Amendment. The government, in a novel legal move, granted him immunity, meaning he would have to testify or face jail for contempt. To avoid this, Giancana fled the country in 1965, seeking refuge in Mexico. His flight was the de facto end of his reign. With Giancana in exile, the leadership of the outfit naturally flowed back to its true center of gravity, Tony Accardo. He was once again the undisputed boss, forced out of his comfortable retirement to stabilize the ship that Giancana's tumultuous leadership had rocked. His first order of business was to restore order, lower the organization's profile, and once again make profit. Not headlines, the primary objective. He appointed a trusted old school lieutenant, Felix Milwaukee Phil Alderizio, as his street boss. But there was no doubt who was truly in command. The era of the celebrity gangster was over. The era of the quiet, the corporate chairman was back. The return of Tony Accardo to active, day-to-day command of the Chicago outfit in the mid-1960s was a deliberate and calculated effort to restore the principles of silence, stability, and profit that had defined his earlier leadership. The flamboyant and dangerous era of Sam Giancana was to be purged from the organization's culture. Accardo's first task was to reassert discipline and remind his soldiers of the consequences of indiscretion. The exile of Giancana was one thing, but there were other loose ends, other potential liabilities that had been created during the previous decade. One of the most significant was the case of William Action Jackson, a high-stakes gambler and juice loan collector who had the temerity to testify before a federal grand jury about the outfit's illegal gambling operations. Testifying, even without directly naming bosses, was an unforgivable sin, a violation of Omert. In 1961, Jackson was found brutally murdered in the trunk of his car, a clear and chilling message to anyone considering cooperation with the authorities. The murder remained officially unsolved, but it was widely understood within the underworld as a sanction approved by the highest levels of the outfit. A stark return to the old ways under Accardo's firm hand. Another key figure from the Giancana era was Mad Sam DeStefano, a notoriously sadistic and unpredictable loan shark and enforcer. While DeStefano was effective at his job, his mental instability and penchant for extreme theatrical violence made him a major liability. He was too loud, too crazy, and too likely to attract unwanted attention. In 1973, as Accardo was consolidating his renewed control, DeStefano was gunned down outside his own home. The hit was widely seen as a house cleaning measure, an elimination of a volatile element that did not fit into Accardo's vision of a smooth, running corporate enterprise. This was the Accardo method. Violence was not for passion or pleasure. It was a business tool used for maintenance and risk management. With the internal landscape stabilized, Accardo turned his attention back to business. The Las Vegas Skim was operating at peak efficiency, funneling millions of dollars back to Chicago on a regular basis. Accardo, with his keen financial mind, oversaw this operation with the diligence of a Fortune 500 CEO. He ensured the money was collected, counted, and distributed with precision, and that the couriers who transported the cash were utterly reliable. He also expanded the outfit's reach into new territories and industries. Through strategic alliances, they exerted influence over criminal operations in other cities, from Milwaukee to Kansas City, often taking a quiet cut of the action in exchange for their blessing and support. The outfit's grip on the labor unions, particularly the Teamsters, remained as strong as ever, allowing them to manipulate pension funds and exert control over major industries. Accardo himself became a ghost in the machine. He rarely met with more than one or two people at a time. His instructions were passed down through a tight chain of command, leaving little direct evidence of his orders. He conducted business in the back rooms of restaurants, in his car, or on walks in secluded parks, always aware of the possibility of electronic surveillance. The FBI, despite knowing he was the boss, found it nearly impossible to build a case against him. They could rarely prove he had directly ordered any criminal act. He was a master of insulation, protected by layers of subordinates and a code of silence that he had ruthlessly enforced for decades. His personal life continued to be a model of suburban normality, a perfect camouflage for his true identity. He was a fixture in River Forest, a family man who enjoyed his home, his children, and the respect of his neighbors, who still knew him as a successful businessman. This duality was his greatest armor. While the newspapers and the public were fascinated with the likes of Giancana, few outside of law enforcement and the underworld understood that the quiet, grandfatherly man living at 1106 North Ashland Avenue was the most powerful and enduring criminal mastermind in the history of Chicago. He had survived conviction, imprisonment, and the reckless leadership of a successor, and had emerged stronger and more secure than ever. But the world was changing, and a new, even more determined generation of federal agents was rising, armed with new laws and a new determination to finally bring down the house that Accardo had built. The 1970s dawned with Tony Accardo at the zenith of his power, a gray eminence presiding over a criminal empire that seemed impregnable. Yet, the very foundations of that empire were being threatened by a new and formidable weapon in the federal government's arsenal, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as the Richo Statute. This revolutionary piece of legislation, passed in 1970, was designed explicitly to combat the kind of sophisticated, corporate, structured criminal syndicates that Accardo had perfected. Unlike previous laws that targeted individual crimes like murder or extortion, Raisu allowed prosecutors to go after the entire organization. It made it a crime to belong to an ongoing criminal enterprise and to participate in a pattern of racketeering activity. For the first time, the boss who gave the orders from a distance could be held as accountable. As the hitman who pulled the trigger, the FBI, now fully committed to dismantling organized crime, began to aggressively apply this new tool. They launched a multi-pronged attack on the Chicago outfit, using wiretaps, electronic bugs, and turning low-level members into informants. Accardo, ever the strategist, understood the threat Raisu posed. He responded by retreating further into the shadows, becoming even more cautious and circumspect in his communications. He assumed his subordinates would exercise the same level of discipline. But the new generation of mobsters was not always as steadfast as the old Sicilian stalwarts he had come up with. The first major breach in the outfit's armor came from an unexpected place, a seemingly minor investigation into the outfit's lucrative street tax on independent burglary crews. A crew of highly successful burglars, led by a man named Lenny Yaras, had been operating without the outfit's permission. When Accardo's men moved in to demand a cut, the burglars initially resisted, leading to a tense standoff. The situation was eventually resolved, but the investigation into this conflict provided the FBI with a valuable entry point. They managed to flip one of the burglars, who provided information that led to wider investigations. This was the beginning of a slow but steady process of erosion. While Accardo himself remained personally elusive, the world around him was becoming increasingly dangerous. The pressure was not just coming from the federal government. It was also coming from within the ranks of the outfit itself. The sheer volume of money flowing from Las Vegas and other ventures created temptations and jealousies. Some crew bosses began skimming from the skim, a cardinal sin in Accardo's eyes. The old guard, men who shared Accardo's code and discipline, were aging out, and the younger generation, products of a different America, were often more greedy and less loyal. Accardo had to constantly manage these internal threats, balancing the need to enforce discipline with the risk of creating more bodies that could attract law enforcement attention. It was a delicate and exhausting balancing act. During this period, Accardo faced a personal legal challenge that, while not a RICA case, demonstrated the government's relentless focus on him. In 1978, the IRS managed to secure an indictment against him for income tax evasion, the same charge that had felled Al Capone nearly 50 years earlier. The government alleged that he had failed to report hundreds of thousands of dollars in income over a 3-year period. The trial was a major media event, pitting the elusive Big Tuna against the full power of the state. Accardo, now in his 70s, sat through the proceedings with an impassive, stoic demeanor. His defense was simple. The government could not prove that the money he spent was from criminal activity. They could not directly link the cash to a specific illicit act. It was a classic mob defense, relying on layers of insulation and the difficulty of proving the source of funds. In a stunning victory for Accardo, the jury found him not guilty. It was a testament to his lifelong strategy of anonymity and his meticulous care in distancing himself from the direct flow of dirty money. He had beaten the feds again in what many believed would be their best chance to put him away for good, but the celebration was short-lived. The acquittal, while a personal triumph, was the last gasp of the old way of doing business. The Rico era was just beginning, and the nets were closing around his key lieutenants. The skimming operation in Las Vegas, the crown jewel of the outfit's financial empire, was about to become the epicenter of its downfall, and the man who had built his legend on silence was about to be betrayed by the one thing he could not control: the voices of his own men. The betrayal that would ultimately unravel Tony, Accardo's empire, did not come from a rival gang or a sudden police raid, but from the desert winds of Las Vegas, carried on the voice of a man who had been one of the outfit's most trusted insiders. The Stardust Casino had long been a golden goose for the Chicago syndicate, a glittering palace on the Strip whose counting rooms were systematically and ruthlessly skimmed of hundreds of thousands of dollars in untaxed cash before the official count was presented to the state gaming authorities. The operation was run with military precision by a man named Frank Lefty Rosenthal, a brilliant and volatile gambling expert with deep ties to the outfit, handling the physical security and the enforcement side of the Stardust was Tony, the Ant, Spilatro, a childhood friend of Rosenthal's, who had been sent from Chicago to be the outfit's muscle in Vegas. Spilatro was short in stature, but a volcano of viciousness, and he quickly earned a reputation for extreme brutality, becoming the inspiration for the character Nicky Santoro in the film Casino. This partnership, overseen from Chicago by Accardo and his inner circle, was immensely profitable but inherently unstable. Rosenthal was a cerebral egomaniac, while Spilatro was a wild, unpredictable force of nature who began operating his own independent robbery and murder crew, drawing a massive amount of heat from the FBI and local police. The situation in Vegas was becoming a public relations nightmare for the outfit, a direct violation of Accardo's core principle of maintaining a low profile. The breaking point came on the evening of October 4th, 1982, when Frank Rosenthal got into his car outside a restaurant and it exploded in a ball of fire. Miraculously, he survived, protected by the car's sturdy frame. The assassination attempt, widely believed to have been ordered by the outfit's leadership due to Rosenthal's increasing recklessness and the fear he might cooperate with authorities, had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of eliminating a problem, it created a witness. Rosenthal, realizing he had been marked for death by the very organization he had served, decided to break the sacred oath of Omert. He began talking to the FBI, providing them with a detailed, insider's account of the entire skimming operation at the Stardust and other casinos. He named names, described the methods, and outlined the chain of command that led all the way back to Chicago. His testimony was the key that unlocked the entire case. But Rosenthal was not the only one. The federal government, armed with the powerful Reichsstatute, had also managed to flip a much higher level insider, Joseph the Clown Lombardo, a powerful Chicago street boss, and, even more devastatingly, they had secured the cooperation of a man named Ken Ito, a mid-level gambling operator. Ito, who had been shot in the head in a botched assassination attempt ordered by the outfit, miraculously survived and immediately began cooperating with the authorities, providing detailed information on the outfit's structure and operations. The walls were closing in for Tony Accardo, now in his late 70s. This was a crisis of an entirely new magnitude. This wasn't a single informant. It was a cascade of them. The old methods of intimidation and murder were useless against witnesses who were already in the Federal Witness Protection Program. The Raicho cases built from this testimony began to systematically decimate the upper echelon of the Chicago outfit. In 1986, in the landmark Stardust Skim trial, several of Accardo's top captains and close associates were convicted and given lengthy prison sentences. The once untouchable organization was being dismantled in court, piece by piece. Accardo himself was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in many of these proceedings. The government's case painted him as the mastermind, the boss of bosses, but they still lacked the one piece of evidence, the smoking gun, that would directly tie him to a specific order related to the skimming conspiracy. He was the ultimate target, yet he remained just out of reach, a ghost watching from the periphery as his lifelong work was systematically taken apart by men who were using his own methods of patience and meticulous record keeping against him. The empire he had built to last 1,000 years was crumbling in a single decade, not from a bloody war on the streets, but in the sterile, brightly lit courtrooms of the American justice system. As the 1980s wore on, Tony Accardo found himself presiding over an empire in an advanced state of siege. The convictions from the Stardust Skim trial had decapitated much of his senior leadership, creating a power vacuum that was filled by a younger, and in Accardo's view, less competent and far more reckless generation. The old codes of honor and discipline, already weakened, were now completely breaking down. The most glaring symbol of this new, chaotic era was the fate of Tony Spilatro, the ain't who had run amok in Las Vegas. Spilatro's independent crimes and his very public notoriety had made him a massive liability. He was a walking, talking violation of every principle Accardo held dear. In the summer of 1986, Spilatro and his brother Michael were lured to a basement in Bensonville, Illinois, under the pretense of a meeting to discuss his future with the outfit. Instead, they were brutally beaten and strangled to death. Their bodies were found buried in an Indiana cornfield. The double murder was a clear message from the outfit's remaining leadership, almost certainly including Accardo's approval, that loose cannons would not be tolerated. It was a desperate, brutal attempt to reassert control and silence a major source of the heat that was burning them. But it was too little, too late. The Spilatro murders only brought more negative attention and provided federal prosecutors with another violent chapter to present to juries, further solidifying the image of the outfit as a ruthless criminal enterprise under the Rights statute. For Accardo, now in his 80s, the world he had mastered was disappearing. The neighborhood social clubs where he had once held court were now under constant FBI surveillance, their walls potentially bugged. The political protection that had once been so reliable was evaporating as politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the toxic brand of organized crime. The steady, enormous cash flow from Las Vegas had been severely curtailed by the convictions and the increased scrutiny on the casinos. The outfit was forced to rely more on its traditional inner city rackets, street tax, juice loans, and prostitution, which were lower yield and attracted a different, more volatile kind of law enforcement attention. Accardo became a relic, a living legend trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. He still held meetings, he still offered advice, and his approval was still sought for major decisions. But the energy and the ambition of the organization were draining away. He spent more time at his home in River Forest, a fortress guarded not just by its respectability, but also by sophisticated alarm systems and the ever-present fear of assassination from within his own ranks. The new breed of mobster, raised on the cocaine-fueled chaos of the 1980s, did not hold the same reverence for the old man. They saw him as a figure from a bygone era, an obstacle to their own ambitions. There were rumors of plots against him, of young Turks who believed the only way to revitalize the outfit was to remove its ancient leader. Accardo, with his decades of survival instinct, was undoubtedly aware of these whispers. His life had become a paradox. He was both the most powerful man in the Chicago underworld and its most vulnerable potential target. The federal government continued its relentless pursuit. In 1990, they thought they had finally found their smoking gun. They secured an indictment against Accardo for a relatively minor offense, lying to a federal grand jury about whether he had ever visited a particular social club that was a known mob hangout. It was a perjury trap, a tactic to get him on something, anything, that would stick. The trial was a surreal spectacle. An 84-year-old Tony Accardo, the last of the old-time bosses, sat in a courtroom and was accused of the mundane crime of telling a lie about his social habits. The government presented evidence, including photographs, placing him at the club. His defense was a mixture of faulty memory and a steadfast refusal to admit anything. The jury, once again, found him not guilty. It was his final victory in a court of law, a last, defiant middle finger to the system that had chased him for 70 years. He had beaten them again, but the cost was immense. The trial had drained him, physically and emotionally. He was tired. The endless war of attrition had taken its toll. The man who had outsmarted everyone, from Capone's rivals to J. Edgar Hoover's G-men, was now an old man watching the sunset on a world he could no longer control, surrounded by traitors and ghosts, waiting for the final, inevitable chapter to close. The final years of Tony, Accardo's life, were a study in quiet. stubborn defiance against the relentless march of time and the encroaching forces of justice. Having been acquitted in the 1990 perjury trial, he retreated completely into the fortress of his river forest home, a stately brick residence that had become both a sanctuary and a prison. The world outside was now alien to him. The Chicago outfit, the magnificent, ruthless machine he had helped build and lead for over half a century, was a shadow of its former self. Its ranks were thinned by prosecutions, its revenue streams crippled by federal oversight, and its code of silence rendered almost obsolete by the effectiveness of the Witness Protection Program. The new generation of mobsters, men like John No-Nose, DeFranzo and Samuel Wings Carlisi, who now jockeyed for power, operated in a different paradigm. They were managers of a declining asset, not empire builders. Accardo was consulted less and less. His wisdom, forged in the bootlegging wars and the glory days of the Vegas Skim, seemed antiquated in an era of digital surveillance and righteous indictments. His life settled into a muted, solitary routine. He would tend to his garden, a hobby that allowed him a measure of the control he had once exerted over a criminal continent. He would take slow, careful walks around his neighborhood, a frail old man who offered a polite nod to neighbors who likely had no true conception of the monumental, dark history he carried with him. The FBI surveillance, a constant in his life for decades, became almost perfunctory. They knew he was no longer an active threat, but they maintained their watch, a testament to the legendary status he held even in the eyes of his enemies. They were waiting, as he was, for the end. His health began a slow, irreversible decline. The immense pressures of a life lived in the crosshairs, the constant vigilance, the weight of countless secrets, and the ghosts of those who had been sacrificed for the good of the organization, had taken a profound physical toll. He suffered from heart problems and the general frailties of advanced age. The fiery temper of Joe Batters was now banked. The sharp, calculating mind of Big Tuna was slowing, forced to focus on the mundane challenges of doctor's appointments and medication. He was surrounded by his family, his wife Clarice, his children, and his grandchildren, who provided a bubble of normalcy and love that stood in stark contrast to the brutal world he had inhabited. It is one of the most enduring paradoxes of his life that this man, responsible for so much misery and violence, was by all accounts a devoted and loving patriarch within the walls of his own home. This was the ultimate expression of his compartmentalization, his ability to wall off the monster from the man. In May of 1992, the end finally came. It was not in a hail of bullets on a city street, not in a prison infirmary, but in the peaceful, comfortable surroundings of his own bedroom. On May 22, 1992, Tony Accardo died of heart failure at the age of 86. The news was met with a sense of historic finality. Obituaries in major newspapers across the country recounted his incredible, almost mythical career. They spoke of the boy from the slums who became a king, the man who never spent a night in jail, the ghost who outlasted everyone. His funeral was a subdued affair by mob boss standards, a reflection of his own lifelong aversion to spectacle. It was held at a Catholic church in River Forest, attended by family, a few old, trusted associates, and undoubtedly a contingent of FBI agents taking notes on the final gathering. There were no extravagant floral displays in the shape of baseball bats or tuna fish, no long motorcades of limousines. It was the funeral of a respected, if somewhat mysterious, suburban grandfather. In death as in life, Tony Accardo maintained his cover. The government, which had pursued him with such singular focus for decades, was ultimately denied its ultimate prize. They could never convict him. He had won his freedom, not through acquittal in a final, dramatic trial, but by simply living long enough to die on his own terms, in his own bed. The legacy he left behind was complex and terrifying. He was proof that the most successful criminal is not the most famous, but the most invisible, not the most violent, but the most patient, not the one who seizes power with a roar, but the one who cultivates it with a whisper. The Chicago outfit would continue to exist after him, but it would never again know the kind of far-reaching, deeply entrenched, and seemingly untouchable power that it had wielded under the quiet, ruthless, and brilliant command of Tony Accardo. To truly understand the monumental legacy of Tony Accardo, one must look beyond the specific crimes and the body count, and instead examine the blueprint he created for enduring criminal power, a blueprint that remains studied by law enforcement and criminologists to this day. His most staggering achievement was his personal legal invincibility in a career spanning 7 decades at the apex of organized crime. He never served a single day of a prison sentence for his countless criminal acts. This was not a matter of luck, but a masterfully executed strategy built on several core principles that became the new gospel for the modern mob. The first and most important was his fanatical commitment to anonymity. He understood that fame was a poison for a criminal. While Al Capone reveled in his celebrity and Sam Giancana courted it, Accardo shunned it with every fiber of his being. He gave no interviews, posed for no memorable photographs, and conducted his business in whispers and shadows. He was a ghost in the machine of Chicago, his name unknown to the general public for most of his career, while his influence seeped into every corner of the city's infrastructure. This anonymity was his primary shield, making it exponentially more difficult for prosecutors to build a public case against him, and for juries to convict a man who seemed, on the surface, to be a respectable, unassuming businessman. The second pillar of his success was his corporate style restructuring of the outfit. He was the architect who transformed a volatile collection of street thugs and bootleggers into a sophisticated, vertically integrated criminal corporation. He instituted chains of command, profit, sharing schemes, and rigorous financial controls. Under his guidance, the outfit moved its investments from purely illicit ventures like prostitution and narcotics, which he generally frowned upon for the excessive heat they attracted, into quasi-legitimate fronts like jukeboxes, vending machines, laundromats, and labor unions. These businesses provided not only massive profits, but, more importantly, a perfect vehicle for laundering money and building a facade of legitimacy. This corporate model also provided crucial insulation. Orders were passed down through multiple layers of management, ensuring that the CEO in the suburbs was never directly connected to the violent acts carried out on the street. He was a master of what the law would later call plausible deniability. The third key to his longevity was his strategic use of violence. Unlike many of his contemporaries who used murder as a first resort or an expression of rage, Accardo viewed it as a precise business tool, akin to a corporate downsizing. Violence was deployed surgically, for specific purposes, to eliminate a rival, to silence a potential informant, to enforce discipline, or to send a message. The murders he ordered were rarely public spectacles. They were quiet, efficient, and meant to be discovered only by those who needed to get the message. This calculated approach minimized public outrage and kept law enforcement from focusing all its resources on the outfit. Finally, and perhaps most critically, was his deep and systemic corruption of public institutions. Accardo did not just bribe individual police officers, he invested in politicians, judges, and union leaders. He understood that true, lasting power came not from controlling the streets, but from controlling the systems that were supposed to govern the streets. This network of corruption was his safety net. It ensured that investigations were stalled, that evidence went missing, that key witnesses changed their stories, and that juries were, on occasion, swayed. This multi-layered strategy, anonymity, corporate structure, surgical violence, and systemic corruption, created a fortress around Tony Accardo that proved nearly impenetrable for the majority of his life. It was only with the advent of the Rights-O statute, a law designed to attack the very corporate structure he had built, and the subsequent breakdown of omerta in the face of long prison sentences, that his fortress finally began to crumble. But even then, at its core, he remained personally untouched. His legacy is therefore a dark and cautionary tale about the nature of power itself. It demonstrates that the most dangerous criminal is not the one who rules through fear alone, but the one who rules through a cold, intelligent, and patient understanding of every lever of power, both legal and illegal, in a modern society. Tony Accardo was not a king of the underworld. He was its chief executive officer, and the corporation he built was more profitable, more resilient, and more terrifying than any that had come before it. The personal life of Tony Accardo stands as one of the most fascinating and contradictory chapters of his entire story, a masterclass in compartmentalization that allowed the ruthless CEO of a criminal syndicate to coexist with the image of a devoted family man and upstanding suburban citizen, while his professional world was a viper's nest of betrayal, violence, and avarice. His home life in River Forest was meticulously curated to be a bastion of normalcy, stability, and traditional values. He married Clarice Porter in 1933, a union that would last until his death nearly 60 years later, and together they raised 4 children in a large, comfortable but not ostentatious brick home. To his neighbors on North Ashland Avenue, he was simply Tony, a successful businessman in the jukebox and vending machine industry. He was the man who mowed his own lawn, put up Christmas decorations, attended Mass at the local Catholic church with his family, and hosted summer barbecues where the guests were often other respectable looking families, some of whom may have been judges, lawyers, or police officials who were either willfully ignorant of his true profession or were active participants in his web of corruption. This carefully constructed facade was not merely for show. It was a critical component of his security apparatus. By embedding himself so deeply into the fabric of a normal, affluent community, he made himself invisible. He was not a lurid figure from the city's underworld. He was a pillar of his own suburban community. And this respectability provided a layer of protection that bodyguards and bulletproof cars never could. Within the walls of his home, by all accounts, he was a loving and present father. He doted on his daughters and took a keen interest in the lives of his children, insisting on a quality of life and an education that he himself had never received. He enforced strict rules, demanding good grades and polite behavior, and he shielded them as much as possible from the dark reality of his work. There are no stories of him discussing business at the dinner table or having his henchmen visit the family home. That world was kept hermetically sealed away. This duality raises profound psychological questions. How could a man who could order a brutal murder with a nod of his head come home and read a bedtime story to his daughter? The answer likely lies in the Sicilian concept of famiglia, the family. For men like Accardo, there was the biological family, which was sacred and to be protected at all costs. And then there was the outfit, which was the business family. The rules, morals, and behaviors that governed one did not apply to the other. This schism allowed him to function, to be a monster in one realm and a saint in another without apparent cognitive dissonance. His home was also his sanctuary from the relentless pressures of his work. It was the one place where he did not have to constantly watch his back, where he could let his guard down, if only slightly. The FBI knew this, and they repeatedly tried to breach this sanctuary. They conducted surveillance on his home, tapped his phones, and even, on one infamous occasion in 1957, planted a listening device in his house. This bug provided a rare, unfiltered glimpse into the man, capturing conversations about business, but also mundane family discussions. The operation was eventually discovered, and the device was found. But it demonstrated the lengths to which the government would go to connect the suburban father to the criminal boss. Despite these intrusions, the Accardo home remained an impenetrable fortress of privacy. His children grew up, married, and had children of their own, giving him grandchildren who knew him only as a kind, elderly grandfather, completely unaware of the towering, terrifying legend he was in the city just a few miles away. This separation was his ultimate triumph. He succeeded in giving his family the legitimate, peaceful life that his own immigrant parents had dreamed of, even if the fortune that paid for it was built on a foundation of blood and corruption. In his final years, as the outfit crumbled around him, it was this family, this sanctuary, that provided his only comfort. The empire he built was being dismantled, but the home he built endured. The story of Tony, Accardo's personal life, is a stark reminder that evil is rarely a cartoonish caricature. It can be a quiet, complex, and horrifyingly normal man living next door. A man who loves his family deeply while simultaneously destroying the families of others without a second thought. It is this chilling normalcy that makes his story, and the man himself, so profoundly and lastingly unsettling. To fully grasp the operational genius of Tony Accardo, one must delve into the specific, intricate machinery of the Chicago outfit during his peak years, a period where his influence extended far beyond the city limits into a national criminal consortium, often referred to as the Commission. This was a time when the outfit was not merely a local gang, but a corporate entity with diversified holdings, both legal and illegal, and Accardo was its chief executive and largest shareholder. The financial engine of the organization was a multi-faceted operation, a complex web of revenue streams that Accardo managed with the acumen of a Fortune 500 CFO. At the most foundational level was the tax, a systemized extortion racket that required any independent criminal operating in Chicago, from bookmakers and loan sharks to burglary crews and pimps, to pay a significant percentage for the outfit for their earnings, to the privilege of for the privilege to the Ossex for the privilege of his unclaimed business. Failure to pay resulted in brutal enforcement, but compliance granted a form of criminal licensure and protection from rival operators. This created a steady, predictable cash flow from the very bottom of the underworld. Above this was the outfit's own direct criminal enterprises, a massive numbers and sports betting operation that spanned the Midwest, a pervasive juice loan business charging exorbitant weekly interest, and its control over certain labor unions. The control of unions, like the Teamsters, was particularly lucrative, as it allowed the outfit to manipulate multi-million-dollar pension funds, extort businesses with the threat of strikes, and place their members in no-show jobs. But the crown jewel, the venture that truly globalized the outfit's reach and profits, was its infiltration of Las Vegas. Under Accardo's guidance, the outfit, using Teamsters pension fund loans as the initial capital, secretly acquired hidden points in several major casinos on the Strip. The skimming operation that followed was a masterpiece of financial crime. Before the casino's daily earnings were ever counted for tax purposes, a team of trusted insiders would systematically remove large bundles of cash from the counting rooms. This skim was then transported via courier, often in suitcases or hidden in vehicles, directly back to Chicago, where it was divided among the top bosses, with Accardo receiving the largest share. This operation generated hundreds of millions of untaxed, untraceable dollars over 2 decades, fueling the outfit's expansion and insulating its leaders from financial scrutiny. Accardo's role in this vast apparatus was not that of a micromanager, but of a strategic overseer. He presided over a board of directors, his top capos, who each controlled their own crew and territory. He would listen to their reports, settle disputes between them, approve major initiatives, and authorize the use of ultimate sanctions, i.e. murder. His power was absolute, but it was exercised through delegation and consensus, a style that prevented any single underling from becoming too powerful and challenging his authority. He also represented Chicago on the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, which included the 5 families of New York and other major crime syndicates. This position gave him a national voice and allowed the outfit to form alliances and negotiate territories with other powerful organizations, ensuring a degree of stability and preventing costly inter-city gang wars. It was at these high-level meetings that Accardo's reputation for intelligence and cool-headedness made him a respected and often feared figure. He was the banker, the strategist, the elder statesman whose opinion carried immense weight. This period, from the late 1940s through the 1970s, was the golden age of the Chicago outfit, an era of unprecedented wealth and power, and it was all engineered by the quiet, unassuming man in River Forest. He had created a system so efficient, so profitable, and so well insulated that it seemed it could run forever. The money was laundered through legitimate fronts. The violence was kept to a necessary minimum, and the political and law enforcement corruption was so deep that the organization appeared untouchable. It was a perfectly calibrated machine for printing money and wielding power, a machine that hummed along smoothly under the calm, unwavering gaze of its creator, Tony Accardo. This was the pinnacle of his life's work, a criminal enterprise so vast and so sophisticated that it challenged the very definition of what organized crime could be. The downfall of Tony Accardo's empire, while precipitated by federal righteous prosecutions, was equally a story of internal decay, a gradual erosion of the very foundations of loyalty and discipline upon which he had built his reign. The old world Sicilian code of Omert, the absolute, unbreakable vow of silence, was not just a romantic ideal. It was a practical, necessary tool for survival. In Accardo's prime, a man who spoke to the authorities was a dead man, and everyone knew it. This certainty enforced a brutal but effective order. However, as the original generation of mobsters, men who had come of age during Prohibition and the Great Depression, began to die off or go to prison, they were replaced by a new breed. These younger men, products of post-war America, were often more motivated by instant gratification and personal wealth than by any deep-seated loyalty to an organization or its traditions. The sheer volume of money from ventures like the Las Vegas Skim created unprecedented temptations. Crew bosses began skimming from the skim, pocketing money that was meant for the top bosses. This was not just theft. It was a fundamental betrayal of the structure, a cancer that weakened the entire organization from within. Accardo, in his later years, found himself constantly battling this internal corruption, a fight far more insidious and difficult than any war with a rival gang. The justice system itself had also evolved in a way that made silence less tenable. The Witness Protection Program, formally established in 1970, offered a way out. A mobster facing a long prison sentence now had a viable alternative. He could break his oath, provide testimony, and be given a new identity and a new life for himself and his family, safe from the outfit's retribution. This was a game changer. The certainty of punishment for betrayal was no longer certain. The government could now offer protection that was, in many cases, more robust than the outfit's ability to retaliate. The dam began to break with figures like Ken Ito, who survived a hit, and most catastrophically, with the testimonies that emerged from the Vegas Skim cases, when men like Frank, Lefty, Rosenthal, and other insiders decided to talk. They provided the FBI with the organizational charts and operational details that they had previously only guessed at. The Raicho statute then allowed prosecutors to use these testimonies to attack the entire enterprise, convicting men for the crimes of their underlings. This created a vicious cycle. As more men were convicted and faced decades in prison, the incentive to cooperate grew stronger, leading to more testimonies and more convictions. For Accardo, watching this unfold must have been a special kind of hell. He had built an empire on a principle of silence, and now he was witnessing that principle being auctioned off to the highest bidder by the federal government. The very loyalty he had enforced with an iron fist was now being purchased with the promise of a reduced sentence. The new generation of leaders who took over the day-to-day operations in the 1980s, men like Joseph, the Clown Lombardo, and John No-Nose DiFranzo were themselves products of this new, more treacherous environment. They were managers of a decline, constantly looking over their shoulders, not just for the FBI, but for the next potential informant within their own ranks. The culture of the outfit shifted from one of long-term strategic planning to short-term survival. The patient corporate model that Accardo had perfected was no longer feasible in an environment where any meeting could be bugged and any associate could be wearing a wire. The moral authority of the old man, once absolute, began to wane. To the young, ambitious gangsters, he was a relic, a symbol of a bygone era whose methods were no longer effective. There were even rumors, never proven but persistently whispered, that some within the organization considered him a liability, a living connection to the past that the FBI would never stop pursuing. The fortress he had built was not stormed. It was hollowed out from the inside. The walls did not collapse in a single, dramatic event. They crumbled, brick by brick, with each plea deal, each cooperating witness, and each conviction. Tony Accardo, the master of control, had finally encountered forces he could not control, the changing values of his own men, and the relentless, bureaucratic machinery of a justice system that had finally found the legal tools to match his criminal ingenuity. His story, in its final act, becomes a tragic lesson in the impermanence of power, demonstrating that even the most perfectly designed system is ultimately vulnerable to the frailties of human nature. The physical and psychological toll of Tony Accardo's chosen life, a 7-decade marathon spent navigating a landscape of perpetual danger and extreme pressure, is a critical, though often overlooked, aspect of his story. To survive and thrive at the apex of the underworld for so long required more than just intelligence and ruthlessness. It demanded a superhuman level of vigilance, paranoia, and emotional fortitude. From the moment he became a significant figure in the outfit. Accardo lived with the constant, grinding awareness that he was a target. He was a target for rival gangs, for ambitious underlings within his own organization, for freelance criminals looking to make a name for themselves, and, of course, for law enforcement. This state of hyper-vigilance became his default mode of existence. He could never truly relax, never let his guard down in public, and never fully trust anyone outside of his immediate family and a tiny, dwindling circle of old, proven associates. Every car that followed his for too long, every unfamiliar face in a restaurant, every wrong number phone call was a potential threat that had to be assessed. His home in River Forest, while a sanctuary, was also a fortress. It was equipped with state-of-the-art alarm systems for the time, and he was known to keep weapons strategically placed throughout the house. The psychological weight of this existence is incalculable. The man who could order a murder without flinching had to live with the knowledge that the same fate could be awaiting him around any corner. This relentless pressure undoubtedly shaped his personality, reinforcing his natural inclination towards silence, secrecy, and emotional detachment. It also took a tangible physical toll. While he remained robust for much of his life, the stress is a known contributor to cardiovascular disease, which ultimately claimed him. In his later years, the stoic demeanor he presented to the world likely masked a deep and profound exhaustion. He had outlived almost all of his contemporaries from the Capone era. Men like Paul Ricca, Sam Giancana, and Felix Milwaukee Phil Alderisio had all passed away, some violently, some from natural causes. He was the last of a dying breed, a living artifact from a more brutal age, and with each passing of an old comrade, he became more isolated, more alone with his secrets and his memories. He had presided over the deaths of dozens, if not hundreds of men, both enemies and former friends. The ghosts of those he had ordered killed, like the unfortunate William, Action, Jackson, or the treacherous mad Sam DiStefano, must have been constant, silent companions in his old age. There is no evidence to suggest that Accardo was plagued by remorse. His worldview likely did not allow for it, but he was certainly a man burdened by history. He carried the knowledge of every secret burial site, every backroom deal, every act of betrayal, both given and received. This immense psychological burden was compounded by the slow, painful disintegration of his life's work. To have built an empire with such care and precision, only to watch it be systematically dismantled in courtrooms by men he would have considered weak, must have been a source of immense frustration and bitterness. The acquittals in his own trials, while victories, were also draining. Years-long battles that sapped his energy and kept him in the public eye he so despised. In his final years, as he became increasingly frail and housebound, his world shrank to the confines of his home and his family. The vast criminal network he once commanded was now just a memory, its operations reduced and its power diminished. The phone calls from his subordinates became less frequent. The stream of visitors slowed to a trickle. The man who had once moved through Chicago like an invisible emperor was now a prisoner in his own home, waiting for the end. His death from heart failure in 1992 was, in a grimly poetic sense, the only way out of the gilded cage he had constructed for himself. The pressures that had defined his life, the fear, the suspicion, the weight of command, finally ceased. The relentless vigilance was over. The story of Tony Accardo's inner life is ultimately a story of the cost of power. It illustrates that the price of building and maintaining a criminal empire of such magnitude is not paid only in the currency of violence and money, but in the slow, steady erosion of one's own peace, one's trust, and ultimately one's very soul. He died a free and wealthy man in his own bed, a victory in his own terms. But it was a freedom that had been purchased with a lifetime of self-imposed imprisonment in a world of his own making, a world of shadows, silence, and relentless, unending war. The mythologizing of Tony Accardo began even before his death, transforming him from a mere criminal into a near legendary figure, a symbol of an era when the underworld possessed a certain dark grandeur and its rulers seemed to operate by their own inviolable code. In the public imagination, fueled by sensational newspaper reports, true crime books, and later Hollywood films, he became the Untouchable boss, the ghost who outsmarted the system. This mythology was built on a foundation of stark contrasts that captured the public's fascination. Here was a man who was a devoted family man and a ruthless killer, a suburban homeowner and an underworld emperor, a high school dropout and a criminal CEO of unparalleled acumen. The nickname Big Tuna, with its folksy, humorous origins, somehow made him seem more approachable, even while his actions placed him in a realm of terrifying power. This myth-making process was something Accardo neither encouraged nor discouraged. He simply ignored it, understanding that his legend, as long as it remained vague and unproven, could serve as an additional layer of intimidation and protection. To the aspiring gangster, he was a role model, proof that it was possible to reach the pinnacle of the criminal world and die an old man, free and rich. To law enforcement, he was the ultimate white whale, an obsession that drove investigations for generations. His ability to avoid prison became the central pillar of his legend, a feat that seemed to defy the very logic of justice. It created an aura of invincibility around him, suggesting that he was not just smarter than his rivals, but smarter than the entire apparatus of the state. This perception was both empowering and dangerous for the outfit. It attracted a certain kind of ambitious recruit, but it also made Accardo a constant, high-value target. The mythology also served to obscure the brutal reality of his business, the public fascination with the gentleman gangster, who lived in the suburbs, often glossed over the broken bodies, the shattered lives, and the systemic corruption that were the true products of his empire. The story of the Skim, Valentine's Day Massacre, is told with a certain macabre thrill, but the story of a small-time bookmaker being kneecapped for failing to pay his street tax doesn't capture the same imagination. Accardo's genius was in ensuring that the messy, retail-level violence of his organization rarely touched his public persona. He was the corporate chairman, not the shop floor foreman. This clean separation allowed the myth to flourish. In the years since his death, the legend of Tony Accardo has only grown. He is frequently cited as the most successful American mob boss in history, the benchmark against whom all others are measured. His strategies are studied in criminology courses, and his life has been the subject of numerous documentaries and biopics. He has become a permanent fixture in the history of Chicago, a dark counterpart to the city's legitimate titans of industry. The location of his home in River Forest is still pointed out, a site of morbid curiosity. The mythology, however, often overlooks the profound tragedy his life represented. He was a man of immense talent, discipline, and strategic vision, gifts that, in another life, could have made him a captain of industry or a formidable political leader. Instead, those talents were channeled entirely into the creation and maintenance of a criminal enterprise that preyed upon the very city he called home. He achieved a form of immortality, but it is a dark and ambiguous legacy, one of fear and corruption, rather than progress or inspiration. The myth of the untouchable Tony. Accardo endures because it speaks to a deep, complex part of the human psyche, a fascination with power that operates outside the rules, with the individual who seems to be above the law. It is a seductive story, but it is crucial to remember that it is also the story of a man whose immense gifts were ultimately wasted, whose life, for all its power and wealth, was confined to the shadows, and whose most enduring monument is not a great achievement, but a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the high, hidden price of living a life built on a foundation of secrets and blood. To place Tony Accardo in his proper context within the broader landscape of American organized crime is to understand that he was not merely a successful gangster, but a revolutionary one who fundamentally redefined the model for criminal leadership and organizational structure for the entire 20th century. When compared to his more famous predecessors and contemporaries, his unique philosophy and methods come into sharp, revealing focus. His mentor, Al Capone, was a brilliant, brutal warlord who understood the power of terror and public relations. Capone's reign was a loud, garish, and violent spectacle, a blaring trumpet of power that ultimately drew the focused wrath of the federal government. He was a revolutionary in his own right, proving the immense profits of prohibition, but his style was unsustainable. Accardo learned from Capone's mistakes. He saw that the spotlight was a trap. Where Capone sought fame, Accardo cultivated anonymity. Where Capone's violence was often public and meant to send a message through terror, Accardo's violence was private, efficient, and meant solely for business maintenance. The contrast with his immediate successor, Sam Giancana, is equally stark. Giancana was a product of the Accardo system who failed to adhere to its core principles. He craved the celebrity that Accardo shunned, involving himself with Hollywood stars and covert operations with the CIA. Giancana's reign proved Accardo's point. His high profile made him a target, forced him into exile, and ultimately led to his murder. Accardo was the anti-Giancana, the living embodiment of the idea that true power is quiet. When compared to the bosses of the New York Five families, Accardo's Chicago outfit often appeared more cohesive, more corporate, and less prone to the internal wars that periodically decimated the New York families. New York had its share of quiet, effective bosses like Carlo Gambino. But even Gambino did not achieve the same level of personal legal invincibility that Accardo maintained for so long. The New York families were often a collection of competing factions, while the Chicago outfit under Accardo was a unified corporation with a clear chain of command and a focus on the collective bottom line. This corporate structure was Accardo's greatest innovation. He was the first true CEO of a major American criminal syndicate. He moved the outfit beyond the personality-driven cults of earlier mobs and built an institution that could, in theory, outlive its founder. He professionalized crime, applying business principles to illicit ventures in a way that had never been done on such a scale before. His focus on quasi-legitimate fronts for money laundering, his strategic avoidance of the narcotics trade to minimize risk, and his sophisticated skimming operations in Las Vegas were all hallmarks of a forward-thinking corporate strategist. He was not a mob boss who dabbled in business. He was a businessman whose product was crime. This model became the gold standard for organized crime groups that followed, both in the United States and around the world. His other great contribution was his mastery of political and law enforcement corruption. While all mobs engaged in bribery, Accardo elevated it to a systemic art form. He didn't just bribe a cop to look the other way. He cultivated relationships with judges, senators, and union leaders, embedding his organization so deeply into the power structure of the city that it became an unofficial shadow government. This deep systemic corruption provided a level of protection that simple violence never could. It ensured the long-term stability of his regime. In the final analysis, Tony Accardo's historical significance lies in this total transformation of the criminal archetype. He proved that the future of organized crime did not belong to the flamboyant warlord, but to the quiet, besuited executive in the suburbs, not to the man who ruled through fear alone, but to the man who ruled through a combination of fear, profit, and deep-seated corruption. He was the bridge between the street-level thuggery of the early 20th century and the sophisticated, globalized financial crime of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. He demonstrated that the most successful criminal is the one you never see, the one who leaves no fingerprints, the one who understands that power, in its most potent form, is not wielded with a shout, but with a whisper. His legacy is the blueprint for the modern criminal enterprise, a chillingly efficient and enduring model that continues to be studied, feared, and, all too often, the final, unanswerable question that hangs over the long and shadowy life of Tony Accardo is not about what he did, but about what he could have been. It is a question that speaks to the tragic waste of a formidable and singular talent, the same qualities that made him the most successful and enduring crime boss in American history. His brilliant strategic mind, his preternatural patience, his mastery of complex systems, his understanding of human psychology, his ability to lead and manage large, disparate groups of people, and his unwavering personal discipline were precisely the qualities that, in a different world, under different circumstances, could have propelled him to the highest echelons of legitimate power and achievement. One can easily imagine an alternate reality where a young Anthony Accardo, born into a middle-class family with access to a university education, becomes a towering figure in the world of corporate finance or a ruthless and effective captain of industry. His knack for seeing profitable opportunities where others saw only risk, his skill in structuring complex organizations, and his ability to negotiate and form strategic alliances would have made him a natural CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He possessed the cold, analytical detachment and long-term vision of a J.P. Morgan or a John D. Rockefeller. Men who also reshaped entire industries to their will, albeit through methods that, while often cutthroat, operated within the bounds of the law, or at least skirted its edges in a more socially acceptable manner. Or, given his deep understanding of power structures and his talent for behind-the-scenes manipulation, he could have been a phenomenal political strategist, a kingmaker whose influence shaped presidencies. He had the patience to play the long game, the intelligence to understand the levers of government, and the charisma, when he chose to wield it, to command loyalty. The same network of contacts he built through corruption could have been built through legitimate lobbying and fundraising. He could have been a figure like Mark Hanna, the political mastermind behind President William McKinley, a man who understood that the true engine of politics was money and organization. Instead, the path laid out for him by the accident of his birth in the slums of Chicago's Little Italy was a narrow and brutal one. The legitimate avenues to power and wealth were largely closed to a Sicilian immigrant's son with a violent temper and a sixth-grade education. The criminal underworld was the only arena that offered him a chance to exercise his immense talents and ambition. He took that path and walked it further and more successfully than anyone before or since. But the cost of that choice was a life lived in the shadows, an existence defined by constant fear and paranoia, and a legacy forever stained by blood and corruption. He achieved a form of greatness, but it was a dark, twisted greatness that ultimately benefited no one but himself and his immediate circle. The city he called home was not improved by his reign, it was corroded by it. The institutions of democracy were weakened by the corruption he sowed. Countless lives were ruined or ended to feed the insatiable appetite of his organization. This is the central tragedy of Tony Accardo. He was a man who possessed the raw material for genuine, historic greatness. But the circumstances of his life and the choices he made channeled that potential into a destructive, rather than a constructive force. He built an empire, but it was an empire of fear. He amassed a fortune, but it was a fortune built on the suffering of others. He achieved power, but it was a power that could never be openly acknowledged or celebrated. In his quiet, suburban home, surrounded by the trappings of legitimate success, He must have understood, on some level, the profound irony of his situation. He had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, power, respect, a loving family. And yet he was a prisoner, trapped by the very system he had created, unable to ever truly enjoy the fruits of his labor without looking over his shoulder. The story of Tony Accardo is, therefore, more than just a gripping crime saga. It is a profound human tragedy. It is the story of a magnificent engine that was never hooked up to the right machine, a powerful force that was directed down a dark and destructive path, leaving behind a legacy not of progress, but of a warning about the seductive and ultimately hollow nature of power attained through fear and corruption. The story of Tony Accardo cannot be considered complete without examining the fate of the Chicago outfit in the years following his death, a period that has seen the near total disintegration of the corporate criminal empire he so meticulously built. When Accardo died in 1992, the organization was already a wounded beast, reeling from the Riccio convictions of the 1980s and the relentless pressure of federal investigations. But it still possessed significant residual power, control over certain unions, and a presence on the streets. The men who inherited this diminished kingdom, first Joseph, the clown, Lombardo, and then John, No-Nose, DiFronzo, were capable street bosses, but they were not visionaries like Accardo. They were caretakers of a declining asset, managing a slow retreat rather than plotting a new expansion. The world had changed in fundamental ways that made the Accardo model increasingly difficult to sustain. The advent of sophisticated electronic surveillance, including wiretaps and hidden cameras, made the kind of intimate, in-person meetings that were the lifeblood of the outfit extremely risky. The continued effectiveness of the witness protection program and the harsh, mandatory sentences under Riccio made cooperation with the government a more rational choice than loyalty for the average soldier. The deep-rooted political corruption that had protected the outfit for generations also began to erode, as federal task forces specifically targeted corrupt public officials, severing the vital arteries of influence that Accardo had so carefully cultivated. Furthermore, the nature of crime itself began to shift. The immense profits that once flowed from illegal gambling and labor racketeering were dwarfed by the money to be made in the international drug trade, an arena the outfit, under Accardo's long-standing policy, had largely avoided due to the excessive penalties and violence it attracted. This left them on the sidelines of the most lucrative criminal enterprise of the late 20th century. New, more fluid, and decentralized criminal organizations, often based on ethnic ties rather than the rigid structure of La Cosa Nostra, began to occupy the spaces the outfit was vacating. By the early 21st century, the Chicago outfit was a ghost of its former self. Its top bosses, men like James, Jimmy the Man, Marcello, were themselves being convicted in landmark trials, such as the 2007 Family Secrets case, which used the testimony of a brotherhood of turncoats to solve a string of old murders, and finally put the last of the old guard behind bars for life. The outfit's control over the city's streets was broken. It no longer had the power to enforce a universal street tax, and its influence over major labor unions was a fraction of what it once was. The once mighty machine that had corrupted City Hall, controlled the Teamsters, and skimmed millions from Las Vegas was reduced to a regional crew, involved in traditional but lower level rackets like sports betting, juice loans, and extortion in the suburbs. The quiet, corporate model that Accardo had perfected required a level of discipline, loyalty, and long-term thinking that simply no longer existed in the American criminal underworld. The world that created Tony Accardo. The world of tight-knit immigrant neighborhoods, of unbreakable codes of silence, of a corruptible and less technologically advanced law enforcement apparatus, had vanished. He was the right man for his time, but his time was over. The empire did not outlive its founder by decades. It crumbled into irrelevance within a generation. Today, the name Tony Accardo is remembered as a legend from a bygone era, a subject for documentaries and history books, a symbol of a time when a single, quiet man could rule a city from the shadows. The organization he led for half a century no longer holds that power. Its downfall serves as the final, fitting epilogue to his story, demonstrating that even the most perfectly designed criminal enterprise is ultimately vulnerable to the march of time, the evolution of law enforcement, and the changing nature of society itself. The house that Accardo built still stands, but it is empty, its rooms silent, its halls haunted by the ghosts of a violent and spectacular past, a monument to a kind of power that the modern world can no longer sustain. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, a deep and detailed exploration of the life and legacy of Tony Accardo, the man who was the Chicago outfit. From the violent streets of Little Italy, where he earned the name Joe Batters, to the corporate suites where he orchestrated billion-dollar schemes as Big Tuna, to the quiet suburban home where he lived out his final days as a seemingly ordinary grandfather. His story is an epic tapestry woven with threads of brilliance, brutality, and paradox. We have traced his rise from a teenage enforcer for Al Capone to the undisputed chairman of the board of America's most powerful and profitable criminal corporation. We have examined the corporate structure he implemented, a model of efficiency that diversified into legitimate fronts, dominated the Las Vegas Skim, and corrupted the very foundations of Chicago's political and judicial systems. We have witnessed his mastery of anonymity, his surgical use of violence, and his unwavering discipline that allowed him to achieve the underworld's ultimate prize, dying as a free man. We have also delved into the profound personal contradictions, the devoted family man who lived a life of quiet domesticity alongside his role as a ruthless crime lord. We have analyzed the slow, inexorable downfall of his empire, not by the gun, but by the gavel, as the Raicho statute and the betrayal of his own men dismantled the institution he had spent a lifetime building. We have considered the immense psychological toll of his chosen path, the constant vigilance, the weight of countless secrets, and the isolation of outliving all his contemporaries. And we have reflected on the tragic waste of his formidable talents, a mind capable of corporate strategy and political manipulation channeled entirely into the destructive pursuit of illicit power. The story of Tony Accardo is more than a chronicle of crime. It is a profound lesson in the nature of power itself. It demonstrates that true, enduring power is not loud or flamboyant. It is patient, quiet, and intelligent. It shows that the most effective way to control a system is not to attack it from the outside, but to infiltrate and corrupt it from within. But his story is also a powerful cautionary tale. It reveals the ultimate hollowness of power, built on a foundation of fear and corruption. It illustrates that such a life, for all its wealth and influence, is a prison of its own making, an existence devoid of peace, trust, or genuine human connection. Tony Accardo won his war against the justice system, but he lost the battle for his own soul. He died free and wealthy, but he was a captive to the monstrous world he created. His legacy is a complex one, a mixture of dark admiration for his abilities and a sobering recognition of the devastation he left in his wake. He remains an indelible part of American history, a symbol of a bygone era of organized crime, and a permanent reminder of the shadows that can lurk behind the most normal of facades. His life forces us to question our definitions of success and power, and to remember that the most dangerous men in history are often not the ones who shout their intentions from the rooftops, but the ones who watch and wait and calculate in the silence. If you have found this deep, immersive journey into the hidden history of the 20th century to be as fascinating as it is unsettling, if you believe that understanding these dark chapters is crucial to comprehending the world we live in today, then your engagement is vital. The stories of the past hold the keys to understanding the present. To ensure you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten, the controversial, and the truly shocking corners of history, I must urge you to take action. Please subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell. By subscribing, you are not just watching a video. You are becoming part of a community dedicated to uncovering the truth, no matter how hidden or uncomfortable it may be. Your subscription supports this channel and allows us to continue bringing you this caliber of meticulously researched, narrative-driven content. So, don't wait, subscribe, ring the bell, and join us as we continue to pull back the curtain on the figures and events that shaped our world, one astonishing story at a time.